Picture this: you are a foreign ambassador, just arrived at the royal palace of Spain in the year 1665. The gilded doors swing open before you. Frescoes of angels stretch across the ceiling. Marble statues stand like silent gods. Crystal chandeliers shimmer with divine light. You're about to meet the most powerful man in Europe, the king of an empire where the sun never sets. But then, he appears. His mouth hangs wide open as if dislocated. His lower jaw juts forward like an animal's snout. Drool drips endlessly. The sounds escaping his throat are not words, but garbled moans, like something drowning. His eyes are unnaturally far apart, planted on K. And that head, grotesquely oversized for a thin, childlike body, hunched like a dying old man. You can't breathe. The man before you isn't a king. He is a creature torn from a nightmare, a face so misshapen it seems assembled by Mista. His name is Charles II, the last of Spain's Habsburg kings. But don't think he was cursed by witches or demons. What created him is far more terrifying: his own family. Are you ready to uncover one of the most horrifying genetic tragedies in human history? Chapter 1: The madness of power and the bloodline obsession of the Habsburgs, the empire that tried to outbreed nature and lost. For more than 200 years, the House of Habsburg reigned not as monarchs, but as the embodiment of divine right, an empire that swallowed time zones, languages, and continents. From the mineral-rich Andes of South America to the spice-laden ports of the Philippines, from the Gothic cathedrals of Vienna to the blazing plains of Castile, their dominion was vast, their ambition unmatched. They were not just rulers, they were architects of a political theology in which the throne and the altar were fused into a single, inviolable authority. And yet, behind the facades of marble and gold, beneath the jewel-encrusted crowns and painted saints, the Habsburgs harbored a fatal obsession, not with conquest, not even with God, but with blood, a doctrine of purity. To the Habsburgs, purity of blood was more than vanity. It was ideology, religion, and insurance policy wrapped into one. They believed their lineage carried something almost metaphysical, divine superiority encoded in their very chromosomes. To allow that blood to be diluted by outsiders, no matter how noble, was, in their minds, to betray the sacred design of God and empire. So they did what no wise bloodline should do. They married inward. But this wasn't just a few isolated cousin marriages. The Habsburgs created a multi-generational breeding program, deliberately repeating close kin unions across more than a century. Uncles married nieces. Double cousins wed. Sometimes a person held 3 or 4 titles, not due to power, but due to being their own relative. The family tree didn't branch, it circled like a noose. Their approach was systematic, not accidental. Historians and geneticists now confirm they knew the risks. Spanish court documents from the 1500s already show concern over infant deaths and developmental deformities. Royal physicians repeatedly warned the crown that marrying closer relatives was resulting in high infant mortality and degenerative traits. Some infants were stillborn, others lived only months. Some had skulls too soft to hold shape. Others had no palate or fused joints or bodies unable to move. And yet, they continued. Why? Because in the Habsburg worldview, it was better to risk deformity than share power. Letting a French, German, or Italian noble line dilute their holy blood was a fate worse than disease. This was not love. This was dynastic paranoia on a civilizational scale. When strategy becomes suicide, modern genetics gives us a horrifying perspective. The average inbreeding coefficient of Charles II, the dynasty's final product, was 0.254. For comparison, the child of full siblings has a coefficient of 0.25. Charles exceeded even that. But Charles wasn't the product of one scandalous union. He was the terminal node of 11 generations of increasingly close marriages. In him, the recessive mutations didn't just accumulate, they amplified. By the time he was born, there were almost no unmutated genes left to mask the errors. His genetic code read like a compilation of every hereditary misstep his ancestors ever made. The cost of purity had become so high that nature itself declared bankruptcy. And the family tree, it no longer resembled a tree at all. Take Anna of Austria, for example. She appears in Charles's family chart as his aunt, his grandmother, and his great-grandmother, all at once. Philip II was his grandfather and great-great-grandfather. The loops in the Habsburg genealogy resemble a Mobius strip of madness, a twisted genealogical maze where names repeat like echoes in a tomb. This wasn't nobility. This was genetic entombment. A legacy trapped in its own loop. And what of the ideology behind it? The Habsburgs believed their empire was ordained by heaven, that their bloodline carried a sacred mandate, that in maintaining purity they preserved not just identity, but destiny. But nature is indifferent to dynastic myth. Evolution doesn't yield to crowns. It favors variation, not isolation. The same mechanisms that drive mutation also drive resilience. By removing genetic diversity, the Habsburgs had removed their only natural defense against degeneration. What they called purity was actually biological collapse. What they viewed as strength, an unbroken chain of inheritance, was actually a slow-motion suicide pact with their own DNA. The curse that wasn't a curse. Charles II, the tragic figure at the center of this story, was not cursed by witches or the devil. He was engineered into suffering by generations of calculated incest. And therein lies the horror. The system worked exactly as designed. This wasn't the accidental folly of kings. It was a doctrine, executed with terrifying consistency. Charles was not an outlier. He was the conclusion of a twisted logic pursued to its inevitable, nightmarish end. In the end, the very blood the Habsburgs had once exalted as sacred became the poison that destroyed their line. And Charles II, unable to walk properly, speak clearly, or sire an heir, stood not as a sovereign, but as a monument to one of history's most tragic delusions. That power can defy biology. Chapter 2. The Making of a Monster. Charles's body as a biological horror. A king born broken and the empire that lied to itself. The birth of silence. On the cold morning of November 6, 1661, the birthing chamber of the Spanish royal palace should have erupted in joy. It didn't. There were no bells, no hymns, no wine poured in celebration, just silence. The midwives didn't rejoice, they froze. The newborn prince lay limp in their arms, a creature not so much birthed as exhumed. His skin was the color of candle wax. His skull bulged and throbbed unnaturally, as if overfilled. His limbs frail and motionless, his eyes, set too far apart, asymmetrical, almost amphibian, blinked independently. His mouth hung open in a gape so wide and motionless that one attendant whispered, "Is he already dead?" But worse than death was the truth. He was alive. Behind closed doors, whispers became dread. Was this the child meant to carry the greatest empire in Europe into the future? Was this the divine heir of the Habsburg line? A palace built on denial, the answer was clear, but the crown would never admit it. Truth became treason. The king, Philip IV, issued immediate orders. All sketches or paintings of the infant were to be destroyed. No one was to speak of the prince's deformities. Physicians were required to sign official statements declaring the child healthy, even as they watched him struggle to feed, breathe, and blink. Midwives were threatened with execution if they spoke of what they had seen. The official narrative was forged. The prince is strong and blessed. God has granted Spain a worthy successor. But reality refused to be silenced. At 6 years old, Charles still could not hold up his head. He flopped in the arms of his nursemaids like a rag doll. At age 8, he finally staggered his first steps, but not from strength. He walked like a puppet with tangled strings, grabbing at furniture to avoid collapsing. Speech came later, barely intelligible, soaked in slurs and groans. His words had to be interpreted by those closest to him, who had memorized his sounds like a foreign language. Even his cries were unnatural. Servants would later describe them as not human, like the moaning of something half alive. The face that could not be hidden by the age of 5, the palace could no longer pretend. Painters were summoned to produce his first official portrait. Among them was Juan Carreño de Miranda, one of Spain's most respected artists. But what he saw shook him to his core. He refused at first to begin the commission. In a private letter to his wife, Miranda wrote, "The boy is not a child, but an omen. His face is a warning carved in flesh." The infamous Habsburg jaw, already a recognizable trait in the dynasty, had reached its final evolution in Charles II. His lower mandible was so enlarged, so misaligned, that even with effort he could not fully close his mouth. Coins could be slipped through the gap between his lips. His tongue, grossly oversized, would slip backward in his sleep, nearly choking him. He drooled constantly. His saliva had to be wiped from his chin every few minutes. Eating was a public humiliation. His teeth didn't meet. Chewing was impossible. Meals were pureed into paste and spoon-fed by attendants. Even then, he often gagged, coughed, and leaked soup from the corners of his lips. Eventually, Charles began refusing food altogether if others were present. He would rather starve than endure the gaze of his own court. A skeleton designed to collapse Charles's physical deformities were not isolated to his face. His entire skeletal system was a symphony of dysfunction. He stood just under 5 feet tall, but it was not the height that was troubling. It was the structure. His spine curved forward, his shoulders hunched permanently, giving him the silhouette of a man twice his age. His limbs were emaciated, bird-like, and seemed disconnected from the rest of his frame. His torso was stunted and compressed, as though crushed from above before birth. Court doctors noted that he often shuffled instead of walked, and when left unsupported, he collapsed like a folding chair. His skin, sallow, mottled, and prone to unexplained rashes, was constantly irritated. His hair fell out in uneven clumps, revealing patches of raw red scalp. By the time he reached adolescence, he looked like a dying monk, always cloaked in heavy robes, even in summer, because he was perpetually cold. Another sign of deep metabolic dysfunction. The scent of decay, but perhaps the most disturbing feature of all was his smell. Multiple letters and court documents referenced the strange odor that clung to Charles. One servant described it as meat just turning. Another called it the damp scent of something buried too long. This wasn't typical body odor. This was rot, metabolic decay from within, a probable result of endocrine failure, liver dysfunction, or other consequences of extreme inbreeding. Modern medical historians suggest Charles may have suffered from mitochondrial disorders and growth hormone deficiencies, worsened by congenital malformations and systemic inflammation. His body was failing to process its own waste, poisoning him from the inside out. The king who knew, but perhaps the cruelest tragedy of all, was that Charles understood. Not always, but sometimes, terrifyingly, he knew. In rare, lucid moments, he would cry uncontrollably. He often demanded his own reflection be removed from mirrors. And sometimes, when his mental clarity returned for brief periods, he wrote, one letter, trembling and nearly illegible, survives. I am a prisoner in my own flesh, and God has made me king of the world as some cosmic jest. That line is more than a cry for help. It is a eulogy, written by a man still alive, a monarch who ruled the most powerful empire in Europe, yet had less autonomy than the stable boys who fed his horses, a child made into a king made into a ghost. Chapter 3, A King Without an Heir, Tragedy in the Bedchamber. When the most powerful throne on earth could not create a single son. In monarchies, especially in 17th century Europe, a king could be cruel, weak, even mad. But he could not be barren. A monarch's legitimacy rested not only in his bloodline, but in his ability to extend it. His dynasty, his empire, his God-given authority, all of it was sustained by one thing: a child. For Charles II, this duty, the simplest biological act, was a cruel impossibility. The first queen, Marie-Louise of Orléans. At 17, Marie-Louise was the picture of royal innocence, a French princess raised in Versailles, fluent in poetry, courtly manners, and the romantic ideals of marriage. She dreamed of love, children, and life as the queen of the mighty Spanish Empire. What she received instead was a living ghost. From the very first night, it was clear something was wrong. The palace held its breath. Servants waited by the royal bedchamber doors. There were no sounds, no laughter, no celebration. only a pale young girl emerging at dawn, eyes downcast, lips trembling. Behind her, Charles appeared confused and dazed, unaware of the disappointment he had just sealed. The marriage was never consummated. It never would be. Spanish court physicians would later examine Charles and note that his reproductive organs were severely underdeveloped, a condition now understood as likely caused by hypogonadism, a result of his extreme inbreeding. The king had the genital maturity of a child, incapable of sexual function. He could not perform. He could not sire. But in the walls of El Escorial and the streets of Madrid, this truth could never be spoken. So, as always, the blame fell on the woman. Marie-Louise was branded barren. She was forced into humiliating rituals. Folk potions, herbal tonics, laced with crushed beetles and dung, invasive medical examinations that left her bruised in body and mind. Priests laid hands on her belly. Court healers suggested exorcisms. She was not treated like a queen. She was treated like a cursed vessel. Letters from a dying soul. In private letters to her family in France, letters smuggled past Spanish courtiers, Marie-Louise's despair is palpable. I am married to a ghost. He is more pitiful than frightening, and yet impossible to love. I feel the eyes of 1,000 men upon my womb, as though I carry their empire in my veins. Her days became filled with silence and prayer. Her body, weakened by stress, malnutrition, and depression, began to waste away. At just 26, she collapsed. The official cause of death, appendicitis. But among those who loved her, rumors swirled: poison, suicide, grief. Whatever the truth, the Spanish court moved swiftly to erase the scandal and replace her. The second queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, the Habsburgs chose again. This time, not a romantic dreamer, but a political tool, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a strong-willed German princess from a family famous for its fertility. She had 23 siblings. She was chosen not for her charm, but for her womb. Her mission was clear: bear an heir, or Spain will die. But by the time she arrived, Charles was already fading. He spoke in fragments, often unintelligibly. He drooled during meals, needed assistance to stand, and drifted between states of childlike confusion and tormented silence. His eyes, bloodshot, clouded, seemed to plead more than laid. Whether Maria Anna ever attempted intimacy with him is lost to history. Some say she tried, others say she refused outright, realizing the truth within days. Perhaps she was too frightened. Perhaps she saw the futility. Or perhaps she simply could not bring herself to lie. Regardless, the result was the same: no heir. And with that, the empire's pulse grew faint. A womb becomes a battlefield. Charles's infertility wasn't just a private humiliation, it was a continental crisis. All of Europe was watching: the French Bourbons, the Austrian Habsburgs, the Dutch, the British, the Italians. Each house had their claim. Each was armed with lawyers, diplomats, and eventually soldiers. Because Charles wasn't just a man, he was the gatekeeper of global power, and without a son to inherit the throne, that gate would be blown open. His death on November 1st, 1700, at the age of 38, without an heir, was the final domino. Within months, Europe descended into chaos. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, a war not of ideas, but of blood and wombs. A war over a vacant cradle. Hundreds of thousands would die, borders would shift, empires would rise and fall, and all of it, every cannon fired, every child orphaned, every king dethroned, would trace its origins to a marriage bed that never stirred. Chapter 4: Exorcisms, Demons, and the Final Madness of a Dying Empire. When the cross replaced the scalpel and madness became doctrine. When medicine failed, the crucifix was raised. When reason crumbled, ritual took its place. The Spanish court, surrounded by centuries of decadence and denial, was no longer capable of confronting truth. The idea that their king, a Habsburg, God's anointed, could be the product of human error, of failed blood, of generations of incest, was too terrifying to accept. So they found another explanation. He was possessed. When a throne becomes an altar, What followed was one of the most surreal spectacles in royal history: public exorcisms of a living monarch, performed in front of nobles, clerics, diplomats, and God. These weren't solemn spiritual affairs hidden behind cathedral doors. They were choreographed performances of spiritual desperation held in the very throne room of El Escorial. Imagine it, the chandeliers dimmed, relics placed on crimson pillows, the King of Spain, clad in velvet and trembling, kneeling on the marble floor as priests shouted Latin invocations into the vaulted ceilings. At the center of it all stood Father Antonio Fernández Dandaras, a man half priest, half inquisitor. His eyes were said to burn with faith. His voice boomed through the halls like thunder. But behind the devotion was something more sinister, power rooted in fear. Charles was forced to drink holy water mixed with powdered bone fragments from saints' relics, a concoction so foul it triggered violent vomiting and seizures. To the exorcists, this was confirmation. The demons are reacting. They would bind him, press heated crucifixes into his chest until his skin blistered, wave incense and chant ancient rites as his body writhed and spasmed, more from trauma and weakness than spirits. Servants reported hearing guttural howls from behind closed doors. Unlike anything human, some began whispering that the king wasn't just cursed, but already half devil himself. And yet, he returned, again and again, because for Charles, these rituals offered something nothing else could: relief, however fleeting. A brief moment where the horror had a name, and therefore perhaps a cure. The ritual purge. When the palace burned itself by the late 1690s, the obsession metastasized. The church no longer saw the king as the only afflicted entity. The palace itself was now infested. Priests began diagnosing spiritual contagion within walls, furniture, and possessions. The palace's air was said to be thick with demonic resonance. Objects were catalogued as potential hosts: gifts from Protestant monarchs, mirrors, old portraits, silk bedding from France, even musical instruments. In 1698, a monumental purge began. Hundreds of items were hauled into the courtyards and burned: golden trinkets, royal robes, paintings, toys from Charles's childhood, even entire thrones. Priests in black cassocks circled the fires, chanting psalms and pouring holy water onto the flames. The smoke could be seen from central Madrid. Locals feared invasion, but the enemy was not foreign. It was imaginary. These bonfires were not rituals of purification. They were acts of collective insanity, a court performing its denial in flames. The empire wasn't just collapsing politically, it was spiritually disintegrating, one relic at a time. The king who believed Charles II, physically broken, intellectually stunted, emotionally fragile, believed it all. To him, the demons were real. They had to be. Because the alternative, that he was simply born wrong, malformed by generations of his own family's arrogance, was unthinkable. To believe in demons was to preserve the illusion that he was still chosen, still royal, still sacred. He began requesting exorcisms himself, sometimes begging through tears. He believed the pain proved progress, that vomiting meant cleansing, that blisters were signs of God's battle on his behalf. In the last 5 years of his life, Charles underwent over 50 official exorcism ceremonies. Some lasted hours, others stretched for days. He was weakened, skeletal, unable to speak at times, but he insisted on continuing, because to stop would mean admitting the truth, and in the Habsburg world, truth was the most terrifying devil of all. Hollowed out by faith, by fear, by blood. By the time Charles II died in 1700, he was no longer a king. He was a relic, a decaying vessel, carried from ritual to ritual, sustained by fear and denial more than flesh and bone. His body had been burned, blistered, bled and blessed, over and over, in a desperate attempt to fix what centuries had broken. He was not healed. He was exhausted. He was emptied. And so was his empire. Chapter 5. The Final Verdict: How a Dynasty Died in a Broken Body. An Autopsy of Empire. A Death Sentence in Human Form. On the quiet night of November 1st, 1700, the royal palace of Madrid did not echo with morning chants or the solemn rhythm of state drums. There was no successor waiting at the foot of the bed, no heir clutching a trembling royal hand. There were no sons, no brothers, only royal physicians draped in black, taking notes with the precision of coroners, not courtiers. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, was dead, alone, confused, hollowed out by centuries of misplaced faith in blood. What they found during his autopsy would become the most grotesque obituary in European history. A heart the size of a peppercorn, lungs corroded and crumbling at touch, intestines rotted and gangrenous, a skull filled with fluid, testicles black, withered and shriveled like dried fruit. This was not the body of a king. This was a tomb of empire, of arrogance, of evolution betrayed. A bloodline built to collapse. The Habsburgs believed they were more than human. They were God's chosen bloodline, royalty sanctified through lineage. To maintain that divine spark, they rejected outsiders. They turned their family tree into a circle, choking out all genetic diversity in the name of purity. But evolution doesn't worship thrones. It only recognizes one law: adapt or die. In Charles II, nature issued its final verdict. He was genetically pure in the Habsburg sense. His inbreeding coefficient a staggering 0.254, higher than the child of siblings. But this purity was not refinement. It was rot. His body was a cathedral built with crumbling bricks, and every organ was a failing pillar. Charles wasn't sick. He was the natural consequence of generations who thought they could outwit biology. He wasn't just a medical disaster, he was a moral warning. Power at the price of reason. The story of Charles II is not just about one man. It is the tragic climax of a system that consistently chose illusion over truth. The Habsburgs saw deformities in their children and ignored them. They heard warnings from doctors and silenced them. They saw their empire weaken and doubled down on tradition. They traded science for superstition, medicine for miracles, reason for ritual. And Charles paid that price, with a jaw that could not close, with legs that could not support him, with a mind that flickered between childhood and agony, with a life that never truly began, but still had to end everything. And when he died, Spain unraveled. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, sucking Europe into bloodshed for over a decade. Hundreds of thousands died, not because of greed or conquest, but because one man could not produce a son. Because his ancestors refused to understand that a throne built on genes alone is a throne built on quicksand. The mirror of Charles II. Walk through any grand museum today and you may see a portrait of Charles II. At first glance, he looks regal, royal, draped in ermine and velvet. But look closer, his mouth droops, permanently ajar. His eyes, fogged with sadness, look past you, not at you. His jaw juts forward unnaturally, almost grotesquely. A face carved not by an artist, but by history's most merciless sculptor. Evolution. He is not just a man, he is a monument to hubris. A lesson in the language of bone and blood. Because Charles II's tragedy was not that he ruled poorly. His tragedy was that he had no chance to rule at all. He was born already sentenced, not by God, not by fate, but by the choices of generations before him. His life was less a reign than a slow, painful erosion. Every breath he took was a reminder that no amount of gold, no choir of priests, no act of parliament can undo the laws of nature. The eternal warning: the Habsburg dynasty may be gone, but its error lives on, in every institution that chooses dogma over adaptation, every ideology that prizes insularity over diversity, every society that values legacy over life. Because Charles II is not just history, he is a mirror, held up to every modern system that insists on self-preservation at all costs. Every time a bloodline, a party, a religion, a nation chooses purity over resilience, every time power becomes more important than truth, we risk becoming Charles II all over again. The end. Or the final question, what if the monsters of history weren't born evil, but were created by the very systems that claim to protect them?